Hello, everybody. Welcome to the National Collaborative for Foster Alumni in Higher Education webinar series. My name is Jenna Thompson, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker and PhD candidate at Washington State University, working in the foster care research lab. Today's presentation and past presentation will be available through the NRC-FAHE website and their YouTube channel, which I'll drop a link in the chat in just a moment here. Please contact Dr. Amy Salazar if you're interested in presenting at a future webinar or you know somebody else who might be. I'll also drop her email in the chat if you are interested in reaching out to her afterward. This we have about a 45 minute presentation today, followed by some time for Q&A. So please feel free throughout the webinar to type your messages in the chat, and then we will get to those at the end. So today we have the pleasure of having Kara Graham join us today to talk about her work. Kara is a graduate research associate in the College Impact Laboratory at The Ohio State University and a PhD candidate in higher education and student affairs, whose work bridges research, policy, and practice to advance equitable outcomes for students with foster care experience. So without further ado, I will turn things over to you, Kara. Thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, thank you, Jenna. Good afternoon, everybody. I am grateful for this opportunity to share my research with you today. And I hope that you all take something away that's helpful for your work as well. So in addition to my academic endeavors, I'm also a committee chair for a program that provides post-secondary grants to young adults who are or were in care in Hamilton County, Ohio, and that's Cincinnati. For those of you who are not familiar with Hamilton County, that role has given me a front seat into this work and help inspire this project. So today we're going to explore a lesser known budgeting blind spot for post-secondary students. We're examining the off-campus living allocations that colleges create through a poverty-based lens. And while the data that I'm going to share here today is on a national level, I've incorporated implications for students with foster care histories because I think these findings are particularly relevant for the student population. To start, I'm just going to provide you some background on the financial barriers for post-secondary students with foster care backgrounds and a brief overview of a few of the policies already in place for these young adults before going into my research. So when I'm talking about students with foster care experience during this presentation, I'm referring to transition age foster youth. These are post-secondary students who are positioned to transition out of care that might be using extended supports provided by the state or who have already emancipated. While some of these young adults successfully transition to independence, others experience significant economic instability, regardless of whether or not they pursue post-secondary education. Transition age youth face elevated risks of homelessness, food insecurity, and other basic needs challenges as they attempt to establish self-sufficiency. So while basic needs insecurity affects students across all institutional types and demographic groups, evidence consistently indicates that students who've experienced foster care face disproportionately high levels of financial insecurities during college. So federal and state policies have aimed to support these transition age youth and SEFC, which is what I'll call students with experience in foster care and post-secondary education. And they developed and these policies have developed incrementally over the past couple decades. But there's substantial variation in implementation across the states. So I'm going to share a couple of the federal policies today. However, it's just important to know that there are other policies in place both at the federal and state level, and many of these aim to fill the financial need gaps for SEFC enrolled in post-secondary education. So some of you might be aware of the John H. Chafee Foster Care Program for Successful Transition to Adulthood. That enables states to provide housing assistance and other services to foster youth through age 21, and in some cases up to age 23. Nearly all states offer some form of living supports beyond age 18. And the purpose of this program is really just to ease the transition to independence. Research suggests that extended care helps increase self-sufficiency and improve basic needs outcomes with lower rates of homelessness and food insecurity for foster youth. It's also associated with increased post-secondary enrollment rates, but degree completion at age 23 is a bit mixed right now. The other program that I would like to talk about is the Education and Training Vouchers Program, which also stems from the CHAFE. It provides SEFC with up to $5,000 annually for post-secondary expenses for up to 5 years or through age 26. While ETV receipt is associated with higher persistence and completion rates, it's an underutilized program. So a recent study found that only 37% of eligible students access these funds with limited multi-year usage. And the other thing that I wanted, oh, well, I'll go into this later, but differences in state level administration, funding, and program design have been attributed to variations in post-secondary outcomes for SEFCs. So for example, that same study that I just referenced, it's a 10-state study. It found that 6-year graduation rates ranged from 9% in Ohio to 18% in Florida among ETV eligible students who enrolled in 2- and 4-year colleges. Students filling out the free application for federal aid, more commonly known as the FAFSA, indicate if they were in foster care or ward of the court at age 13 or over. Qualifying students receive independent status for federal financial aid, which excludes any parent or guardian income from the federal aid calculations. So in the 2025-2026 academic year, independent students could receive up to $7,395 in Pell Grant funding for what equates to about 6 years of full-time attendance. Or they could borrow up to a maximum of $57,500 in federal undergraduate loans. And just for reference, dependent students can only borrow up to $31,000 during their undergraduate education. So research indicates that federal financial aid is also underutilized for the student population. But we don't really have a super good handle on that because the way the FAFSA question was asked is that it groups a couple different questions together to identify foster youth. So prior to the FAFSA Simplification Act, that question included students who indicated that they were an orphan parent, which means their parent or guardian had deceased, had passed away. But today, the FAFSA question now breaks down that old multi-part question into its individual elements. So in the future, we'll have a better handle on what financial aid uptake looks like at the federal level for foster youth more specifically. So the research I'm sharing today draws attention to a less examined policy issue that may also constrain post-secondary success for SEFC and other financially vulnerable students, and that is the living costs within institutional costs of attendance. College and universities that participate in federal financial aid programs are required to establish what I'm going to call COA estimates throughout most of this presentation. And those include tuition, fees, books, supplies, and expected living expenses, such as housing and food. Prior research has identified mismatches between local costs and off-campus living allocations with wide variations, even within localized geographic areas. One of the first research projects to go over this was one published by Dr. Kelcham, Goldrick, Rabb, and Hosh, who found that nearly half of all U.S. colleges during the 2013-2014 academic year provided living allowances at least 20% above or below county level living estimates that they created. The Urban Institute researchers looked at colleges within the same metropolitan statistical areas and found that first-year students tended to borrow more at colleges that set higher living allowances. And then the JBay research team examined public colleges in California and found that over 50% use off-campus living budgets that are lower than estimated regional costs. So these off-campus living allocations are set by institutions, and they can vary within the same location, representing a financial blind spot for students. So for SEFC and other students living off campus, the adequacy of these living allocations has significant implications because the COA establishes the maximum amount of federal aid a student can receive. When the living allowances are unrealistically low, students might receive insufficient aid, or they might develop inaccurate expectations about the true cost of attendance, increasing the risk of financial strain. Conversely, when the institutional living cost estimates are unrealistically high, Students may be discouraged from enrolling or may borrow more than necessary. And food and housing insecurity has been linked to lower academic performance, poor physical and mental health, and reduced persistence. The foster youth community as a whole is actively trying to fill the gaps in COA for foster youth in higher education. So even when these gaps close, some students might receive less aid than others due to these off-campus living mismatches within the same local area. So I'm going to move on now to talk a little bit more about the foundational framework behind this study and introduce the research methods, measures, and the sample. So the purpose of this project is to evaluate off-campus LISME estimates using the supplemental poverty measure thresholds. And the first objective is really to assess the relative adequacy relative to that threshold. And then second is to identify differences between 2- and 4-year colleges. The purpose of the COA is to assess students' eligibility for federal financial aid. It's an assessment of all reasonable educational expenses that a students can incur while they're enrolled. So it's both conditional on their enrollment and time limited to their enrollment. And then also the maximums that I mentioned earlier. Fortunately, legislators that created the Higher Education Act of 1965 and its related amendments recognized that for students to attend part-time, that the COA needed to include both direct and indirect educational costs. So direct educational costs are billed by the institution. So that would include things like tuition and fees, or if the student's living on campus, it would include room and board. Indirect costs, specifically for off-campus students not living in institutional housing, would include living allocations that I've talked a little bit about, as well as other costs while they're enrolled that they might incur off campus. So colleges must create numerous estimates to tailor their COAs to student body needs. They create allocations for students living in institutionally owned housing, students living off campus, students living with dependents, students living with a parent or guardian, military connected students in military housing or receiving housing allowances. Plus, there's additional rules for other student populations, such as those with disabilities or who are incarcerated, and that's not even a complete list. Really, colleges are trying to tailor those CO estimates to their student body. So for this analysis, I'm using the SPM thresholds as the analytical framework for addressing my research questions. By using this poverty-based lens, it provides some additional context to these living allocations, complementing and extending other research in this area. So the supplemental poverty measure provides thresholds that are suitable for evaluating the relative adequacy of colleges' off-campus living allowances. The federal government's been reporting this measure alongside the official poverty measure since 2011. You might be more familiar with the federal poverty measure, which is the same thing as the official poverty measure. Unlike the official poverty measure, which applies a uniform threshold across the continental US, the SPM incorporates geographic variation in housing costs by location and better reflects household needs by including expenditures for food, clothing, shelter, utilities, telephone, and internet, with an additional 20% intended to account for additional necessities such as like personal care or non-related work travel. The SPM thresholds incorporate local housing cost differences using a core-based statistical areas. So that's what the Census Bureau is using as an umbrella term for all of the micropolitan and metropolitan areas across the United States. And that allows for this benchmarking to occur at a local level where each institution is located. So some of you might already be familiar with the supplemental poverty measure. This next slide guides us through how these thresholds work in the SPM. So the SPM was not intended to be a replacement for the official poverty measure. Instead, it was intended to be a complement to understand Americans' financial well-being while taking into consideration all of their household resources, including government benefits. So when economists calculate the supplemental poverty rate, there are two basic parts of the equation. First, there's the supplemental poverty level threshold that you can see here on the left, which is the poverty-based measure of the money needed to cover a household's basic needs by location. The second part of this equation aims to identify how much money each household has to spend against these basic needs. So the first part of the equation includes the necessities we just discussed. These are sourced from the American Community Survey, as well as and they've also included some in-kind, or sorry, imputed some in-kind government benefits. The idea being that they're trying to get a more holistic view of the needs um, within the household. The second side of the equation takes household income, adds government benefits received, and subtracts household expenses such as work-related transportation costs, taxes, etc. So for this analysis, we're only using the first part of the equation. But the one thing I did want to mention here is the second part of the equation, which we're not using, does take into account work-related transportation costs. We're going to come back to this just little bit later in the presentation because that does play into some of the findings or some of the analysis that I did for this project. All right, so let's go into the research methods, measures, and sample a little bit. So the final data set included 1,590 public colleges enrolling full-time, first-time undergraduates. These are degree-granting 2- and 4-year public colleges that participate in the federal financial aid program across all 50 states and Washington, D.C. I excluded primarily online institutions and U.S. military academies, but I did include regional colleges when possible. The dataset also uses publicly available 2022 supplemental poverty thresholds and data from the Integrated Post-Secondary Education Data System. That's commonly known as IPEDS, if you're not familiar with that. And I'm using data from the 2022-2023 academic year. So institutions providing federal financial aid submit information to IPEDS each year, and this includes COA information and numerous other institutional metrics on revenue, spending, faculty, student body characteristic, financial aid, and other student outcomes at the institutional level. The off-campus, and so we are just examining the off-campus living allocations that were reported for students not living with a parent or guardian. And then to understand how to so the SPM threshold actually is mostly calculated for households with 2 adults and 2 children. So I use the Census Bureau's matrix to convert to single adult equivalents and adjust to a 9-month academic year to represent the same time frame as the IPEDS data. 30 institutions were not included in this analysis because some of the metros were not provided in the public supplemental poverty threshold measure data. So I used a couple different statistical tests throughout to address the research objectives. And before I move on into the findings, I'd like to talk about some limitations. First, this was a descriptive, not a causal analysis. The SPM thresholds don't fully incorporate transportation. So that's the first time I'm going to talk about transportation. They only include non-work related transportation, but institutions can include both transportation to and from college as well as work in their COA estimates. Third, the SPM thresholds aggregate metropolitan areas, which is a standard methodological feature, but the publicly available thresholds also aggregate some of the metros. While IPEDS has several data security checks in place, some data may not be accurately reported. And then I also mentioned that there were 30 colleges removed from this data set. So I hope you found that background helpful. So as we move into the key findings and on into we're going to move on into some of the implications of this research after the key findings. The findings that we're focused on today are broken out by 2- and 4-year public colleges. So since we're indexing the off-campus living allocations to local thresholds, the first series of graphs are data distributions. I apologize, these can get a little bit data heavy, but I just wanted to show you visually how the data change when comparing the SPM thresholds for their geographic area. So the chart that we're looking at here shows the off-campus living allocations that colleges put into IPEDS. And what we're looking at is the distribution for 2- and 4-year public institutions. So you can kind of see on the bottom axis here are numbers, and these are the allocations that these various institutions have provided, and you can see how many institutions provided those allocations. The black line is the standard normal distribution. So you'll notice these data are a bit skewed to the left, especially for two-year colleges, and there's a lot of white space under the normal distribution line for two-year colleges, with many of these allocations below the center peak of the normal curve. And I thought it was helpful to see the change. So the next slide I'm going to show you is what happens when I index them. So after indexing each college's off-campus living allocation to the local SPM threshold, the distributions start to look a little bit more normal. There's not nearly as much white space visible under the black normal distribution line, especially for the two-year institutions. So I'm going to refer to this index as an off-campus LASI. It just stands for off-campus living allocation SPM index. And a value of 100 means the college allocated living expenses at the SPM threshold for its area. Values above 100 show the percentage above the SPM threshold. So if it's 125, it would be 25% above the SPM, the supplemental poverty level. And the values below indicate the percent below the poverty level. So 50 would be 50% or half the supplemental poverty level. So I also wanted to point out the spread of these scores across the bottom axis here. For both 2- and 4-year public colleges, the off-campus LASI values range between 50 and 250. This seems to be a wide spread, and it echoes previous research highlighting potential inequities for students, especially those who are eligible for substantially less aid as a result of their institution's COA. This chart is showing the average differences between 2- and 4-year public colleges. And we can see here there's significantly higher allocations evident for 4-year colleges. On average, 4-year colleges estimated off-campus living allocations roughly $1,000 higher than for 2-year institutions. This is the same chart, but now I've layered in at the top box the off-campus LASI so that you can see the differences between 2- and 4-year colleges when we look at the index. So most public colleges set living allowances above the local poverty benchmarks, but not all. You can see here that 30%, 36% of the 4-years were above, on average, 4-years average 36% above the supplemental poverty level threshold for their area, and 2-years average 28% above. So to pinpoint where the differences were between 2-year and 4-year colleges, I grouped the off-campus LASI values into decile groupings. Except for this within 10% group, that's the second group here, because it includes values up to 10% above and below the SPM thresholds. Again, what we see is there's a fair amount of variation evident. If you add the bars in the first two groups, you can see that 31% of the 2-year colleges were significantly more likely to create allocations near or below the SPM thresholds versus about 15% of 4-year colleges. So in total, this means that if nearly 1 in 4 public 2- and 4-year institutions set living allocations near or 10% below their supplemental poverty threshold. 4-years were significantly more likely to report living costs at this 30 to 39% above level and the 60 to 69% above level. So those are the two circles on the right-hand side. And what this graphic is just showing us is a little bit more clearly where these potential structural inequities occurred between public 2- and 4-year off-campus living allocations. So I wanted to see if urbanacity and regionality might have had an impact on this. So I did take a look at location to see if it was playing a role. And you can see in this table that 4-years cluster in cities and that 2-year colleges are kind of spread across all community types. While there are some regional differences noted here with the asterisk, the regional effect size, which gets a little statistical, it just means that it wasn't all that meaningful. It was fairly low, but it was more impactful for these, the city, the urbanacity. So if you can see the city and the rural are actually highlighted a little bit more because that had a little bit more impact, showed a little bit more impact in the data. So just to summarize that, oh, and then before I go into the next slide, I just wanted to make sure to talk a little bit about these transportation cost differences that I alluded to earlier. So the SPM thresholds only incorporate non-work related transportation. IPEDS, unfortunately, does not break out um, transportation costs separately for other miscellaneous costs because institutions report those two components together during data collection. However, the College Board does collect separate data on these transportation allowances. During the 2022-2023 academic year, transportation allowances for two-year public colleges using data collected from the College Board averaged $1,870. So to get a rough idea of how much these transportation allowances are lifting two-year colleges off-campus living costs, I did some back-of-the-envelope calculations. Without transportation, the average off-campus LASI for two-year public colleges moves from what we saw as 128 before to 112, or 12% above the poverty threshold. So while this is a rough approximation, it just suggests that the transportation allowances might be helping lift off-campus living allocations at two-year public colleges relative to the thresholds. And unfortunately, there were no transportation estimates available for students living off campus at four-year colleges, so I couldn't do the same sort of back of the envelope equation for four-year colleges. So in summary, while public colleges interpret reasonable costs to be above supplemental poverty thresholds, nearly 1 in 4 colleges estimated off-campus living allocations near or more than 10% below the local poverty thresholds, while twice as many 2 years, with twice as many 2 years versus 4 years in that range. So we're comparing the SPM threshold seemed to be a valuable exercise, and it provided new insights into the relative adequacy of public colleges' living allocations, highlighting some potential unintentional structural inequities between public colleges, the public college levels that we just examined today. So these off-campus living allocation differences have been present for some time. The Digest of Education Statistics is like a long-standing data set that has been provided by the National Center for Education Statistics, and it shows that during the 2010-2011 academic year, the difference was wider than what we saw here between 2 and 4 years. Two-year institutions were 14% lower than 4 years in that year. The gap has narrowed to 7% in the 2020-2021 academic year, which is what we see, kind of what we see here in this data. But the mix of 2 and 4 year colleges has changed during this time period, with 2 years decreasing from 59% to 53% in that 2020-2021 academic year. So these data would suggest that the narrowing of this gap may be due to the change in institutions, but it also might indicate that colleges are gradually converging toward some more consistent approaches to estimating off-campus living allocations. But we really just need to better understand the impact of these location-based differences, as well as the institutional practices and administrator mindset. So institutions are likely using different metrics to calculate their off-campus costs. And some other research has already indicated that they do that. So they may be using different local source data. They could be using different estimates for the number of students per room, or even different specific expenses such as internet or phone. But administrator mindsets could also play a role. For example, the low-end clusters correspond to federal aid levels available to eligible first-year students and 9-month adjusted official poverty rate thresholds. The 30 to 39% cluster that I mentioned earlier aligns with 150% of the federal poverty level, a threshold used by some states to determine eligibility for energy assistance. So, after all, what is reasonable is a little bit in the eye of the beholder because there are few explicit guidelines in the Higher Education Act. So, I am in the process of creating a multi-level model to more fully address these location-based differences. The model loosely mimics one built by Dr. Kelcham and Associates in 2017 to examine the differences they found across all U.S. institutions. I'm examining several location-based institutional and student body factors that might be associated with these off-campus LASI values to better understand um, what different factors might be related to the variance that we saw here between institutions. I am currently in the process of trying to procure some data from the College Board. Without that data, it's really difficult to say how the model will unfold, but right now it looks like at least part of the differences between 2 and 4 year college is due to these factors, but the differences between levels seems to be notably significant no matter what I throw at the model. So while the model is not finished, I do expect it to be finished this summer, as well as a manuscript that can be, well, would be sent off for publication. So it might be a little while before that's accessed. But if you have any questions about that, I'm more than happy to address those at a later date as well. So while this study implies that there are some unintentional structural inequities present in colleges' off-campus living allocations, it doesn't really address how this might impact students. We need additional research to determine if low indexing colleges are associated with higher levels of basic need insecurities or other factors like persistence. There are also some financial risks that I've already mentioned during this presentation to under and overestimation of the COA living allowances. Just to reiterate, underestimations can lead to increased financial burdens, and overestimations might lead to increased student borrowing, possibly more than necessary, increasing students' long-term financial burden. SCFC have increased vulnerability to their higher likelihood of attending two-year public colleges, limited financial support after extended care or emancipation in some states, but not all, and sometimes greater reliance on aid when they apply for it. So there is need for additional research, policy, and practice reforms in this area. These findings suggest that we need to better understand why administrators are estimating these lower costs for two-year public colleges. Could administrators have different mental models for students at each level, or are they trying to meet some known thresholds, such as the amount of federal financial aid? Another question I ask is which specific components are included across the various living allocation categories, and are there differences in the components included by level or by college type? So those are just a couple of examples of some research that we might want to look into further as a result of this analysis. And while this research proved to be helpful, it's only examining a subset of public institutions. I think it would be valuable to apply this research framework using the SPM thresholds to all colleges while addressing some of the SPM public data limitations that I ran into with this project. So the geographic indices need to be reconstructed to eliminate these grouped metros. And then the Bureau of Labor of Statistics sometimes creates different thresholds for the SPM. It could be amended to better mirror the COA living allocations because the current thresholds don't include work and school-related transportation. I talked to you a little bit about the multi-level regression analysis that I'm building as part of this research, and it allows for variability um, in the regression at the county level. However, we know that even within counties and some variation exists in living costs. I mean, in Cincinnati, for example, where I live, there are definitely different costs throughout the city, and different costs associated or different costs related to where different institutions are located within the city as well. So to mitigate pushback about the natural cost variation in counties and CBSAs, a geographic information system analysis could also be conducted. And then with data from all institutions, it would then be possible to identify how these off-campus LASIs translate into basic needs and securities using data from the National Student Aid Study. So in 2019 and 2020, the survey captured food and housing insecurities across more than 20,000 institutions in the US. That same study was done again during the 23-24 school year, and data will be released sometime this year. So additional analyses could be run using this 2024 survey to examine outcome differences for students that might be more impacted by these policies. So that would be students that have a low net cost of attendance, for example, students in particular, students with experience in foster care, those with lower incomes, student parents, and other independent students. And from a policy and practice perspective, we just need a lot more clarity around what constitutes these reasonable off-campus living costs. Federal policy implies that basic needs are met, because it currently states that 3 meals per day are required, but it's still unclear what reasonable means. And and so I don't think that it's reasonable that the off-campus living allocations were lower for 2-year colleges relative to 4-year colleges. I'm pretty sure that's not what the intent of the policy was. So legislators might want to consider low living cost floors. To do this, it's important to know what level students' basic needs are more adequately met. So it's possible that even at 200% or more above the SPM thresholds, that students are still facing basic needs or housing insecurities, because at the end of the day, these are emerging adults um, learning to live independently, and they're going to make different financial decisions. So once there's a little more clarity around how these allocations impact students and what the target level might look like, I think it would be possible to create standardized tools that assist college administrators creating these estimates. And it's something that a recent survey found that most of them desire. So many of the COA related financial aid challenges for students with experience in foster care are also encountered by other independent students. The Higher Education Act policies allow for colleges to create COAs for independent students, and some colleges already have this in place. However, there's no mandate included to include COAs for independent students currently. Independent students represent a little more than 40% of undergraduate students, although the percentage in the total population of undergraduates fluctuates um, depending upon the year. There are a few COA areas that could be enhanced for this student population. First is to make enhancements to part-time enrollment allowances. So SEFC and other independent students are more likely to attend part-time. Colleges may, but are not required to, include housing and food costs for students attending less than half-time. Moreover, because of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, colleges are required to prorate student loans based on enrollment levels starting during the next academic year. That means that a student enrolled in 9 hours who can currently borrow at the maximum rate this year will only be able to access 75% of that amount next year. For a first-time full-time independent student, the maximum loan amount would decrease by $2,375. Enhancements to these mandates for part-time students would help SEFC and other independent students. The current HEA policy also mandates that rent and other housing costs be included for students attending half-time or more, but it doesn't specify what constitutes these other housing costs. While it provides colleges a lot of flexibility, all relevant costs for utilities such as gas, electric, water, phone, and internet may not be universally included. And the COA policy allows for some vehicle-related components like operation and upkeep, but vehicle ownership costs are not allowed. Only 24% of the 2-year colleges in this sample provided some on-campus housing, which means that most 2-year students must commute. 40% of community colleges lack a transit stop within about a half mile of campus, and half of those have no stop within 4.5 miles. So for many students, a car is a necessity to get to campus. Moreover, in 2026, car insurance premiums for the 19-year-olds not on a family plan exceeded their family plan peers by more than 20%. While that's not an exhaustive list, the point I'm just trying to make here is that there are multiple aspects of the Higher Education Act that are not friendly to SEFC and other independent students. And then one of my recommendations was also to address the current ETV cap of $5,000 because it was set in 2002, but the consumer price index has increased by 57% since then, and college costs have increased incrementally as well beyond inflation. So FCFC today must finance their education with considerably diminished purchasing power. The ETV awards are also subject to the COA. So we might want to consider amending the COA as a cap while preserving some direct receipt of funds related to the COA. I'm not sure how all states distribute funds, but in Ohio, after the instructional expenses are paid, or institutional expenses, excuse me, are paid, the ETV funds can be sent directly to students. So some students that I've worked with in Ohio like this process, and they appreciate having more than one fund distribution during the semester, which is something they also do in Ohio. Directly receiving the funds when other institutional costs have been covered expedites the time it takes to get the money to the student as well. Um, and then we also need to explore ways to increase ETV uptake while minimizing students' administrative burden. My personal suggestion is automatic enrollment, maybe one pathway that we could explore through the FAFSA, because evidence suggests that automatic enrollment programs outperform opt-in models. And we already identify these students in the FAFSA questionnaire. So by adding a consent within the questionnaire for majority age students, it might help reduce the student's burden, raise awareness, and increase enrollment. But that obviously would be a particularly complicated endeavor, not super easy. Um, so that concludes my presentation today. And then the other, but before I go into questions, I would like to say I didn't really get into some of the other policies because they're not part of this particular research related to how colleges um, provide aid. And so there are some other policies within the Higher Education Act that allow colleges to adjust a student's financial aid level or financial need level. So there are those policies in place. This research really doesn't address those, but there is some really good research in the JBay article that I have included here that talks about that in a little bit more detail, specifically related to foster youth, which I thought was really helpful and quite valuable for the student population. So I just wanted to see if anybody had any questions.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Kara. There's one question around the big, beautiful bill. Um, Wondering if it will end up affecting cost of living allocations by major, or if those are kept separate. They're alluding to some of the changes in the maximum amount of funding that is allowed for students based on like the type of major that they choose or career path, and whether that
Oh,
might
I
impact.
think I think what you're thinking about is for graduate students. Um, so yes, so there I I mean the colleges I don't know of anybody changing institutional living costs by major. So that's really set at the institutional level. That doesn't vary by major, at least not to my knowledge. So I think what you're talking about is the limitations at the graduate level. But obviously, I mean that could impact students, I suppose. But I don't know how I mean, it would indirectly affect students in the same way it would affect undergraduate students.
Mhm. The next person asked, why did you choose to look only at public institutions?
That's a good question. Um, Mostly, I chose to look at public institutions because, well, foster youth oftentimes go to public institutions, and a lot of my work is um, in this space. But the other reason I chose to look at public institutions in particular is that public institutions make education more accessible to the general population. And a lot of students attend public institutions. So it represents a significant portion of the number of students enrolled in higher education. So that's why I chose to look at just at public institutions. And the reason I chose to look at 4-year and 2-year and not um, at some of those that offer just below 2-year programs is because I wanted to keep the cost of living allocations at the academic year level. So to those 9 months. And when you start to look at some of those other programs, the way that they gave their cost of living is at the program level. And so it's a little bit different, and those program lengths can change in time, like the amount of time it takes to complete the program.
Thank you.
Sure.
Are there other questions or any comments that anybody has?
Great information. Great analysis.
I see somebody has unmuted. Did you want to ask your question aloud? Maybe not. Maybe an accidental unmuting.
I don't have a question, but I do have a comment. My name is Chandra Matthew Smith, and I've had the pleasure of working with Kara, and her leadership has just been outstanding in this area. So it's been an absolute awesome experience to work and learn so much from Kara and her work in higher education, and just so excited to be on her team. So thanks for the invitation, and just excited to be here.
Thanks.
Great work, Kara.
Thanks, Rob. Okay. Well, great. Um, Thank you so much for taking your time with me today. I hope this information was helpful for you and your work, and is helpful for us as we think about what's needed for foster youth in the future.
Thank you so much for your presentation today, Kara, and thank you all for joining us today.
Okay,
Hope you have a good rest of your day, everybody.
thanks. Bye.